Hi, I'm Nancy Martin and I live in the Maples, and I'm going to read to you for a little while today. I'm part of the book group here at Green Hills, and we've been interested in travel for a while. Most of you here have done a lot of traveling, and I'm going to read to you a book about travel because we had been reading travel stories in our book group. The first one we read was one by the author John Steinbeck that was called Travels with Charlie, in which he took his big black poodle and rode around the U.S. And he got the idea for the title of his book from Robert Louis Stevenson, who had written a book in the century previous to Steinbeck called Travels with a Donkey. And Steinbeck had been, or not Steinbeck, but Stevenson had been traveling in remote parts of France and getting to know a little donkey. And so today I'm going to read to you Travels with Alice, and it's by Calvin Trillin, and he writes about his travels with his family in the last decade or so, the late 20th century. I'll read you a little bit about him because he's one of my favorites. Calvin Trillin is about to skip town, and he's taken Alice and the girls with him. Well, don't worry, you're going to. Whether it's in Tuscany or in Guadalupe, you may be traveling at an unfamiliar pace if you're among those Americans who drive across the country as if someone's chasing them. Your itinerary may include some whimsical destinations. Alice likes to visit places in song titles, and her husband is still searching for the Italian West Indies. Along the way, Trillin offers his daughters some views on traveling. The view, for instance, that the presence of an $800 per person customs exemption in St. Thomas does not mean that each person is required to spend $800. His daughters offer some views in return. Daddy, I hope you're not going to make a scene about how absolutely fascinating it would be to eat bat stew. You may find yourself confronted by some unusual travel questions. How authentic are the fast food hamburgers at the Champs-Élysées, Burger King, Maison du Whopper? Could the sport of tarot piscine really combine bowls with a swimming pool? If your children admit that to the immigration man at John F. Kennedy Airport that they have spent a month in Europe without seeing one certified major site, will he confiscate your passport? You'll be happy that you went along. So this is the book, Calvin Trillin's Travel with Alice, his wife that he loved very much. And the first chapter is entitled Travels with Suki, who was his sister. I might have seen more of America when I was a child if I hadn't had to spend so much of my time protecting my half of the back seat from incursions by my sister Suki. In the years just after the Second World War, when Suki and I happened to be at our most territorial, our family was out on the road for 5 or 6 weeks every summer. At the time, my father was still in the grocery business, getting up before dawn 6 days a week so he could begin a long day by picking out his produce at the city market. For several weeks every summer, though, he entrusted even that task to others. He had decided it was important for us to see the country. Living in Kansas City, we were, as the real estate people might put it, equally convenient to either coast. not to speak of the Gulf of Mexico, which was only 900 miles or so to the south. We usually headed west toward the Pacific, making our way across the Southwest on Route 66, or cutting up to British Columbia from Highway 40, and then following the coastline down to California. At some point, we'd come to rest for a couple of weeks near the beach in Santa Monica, and what was then called a tourist court. Whichever route we took, we seemed to pass a lot of mesas, also buttes. If I'd had a sister with an expansionist backseat policy, I would probably now know the difference between a mesa and a butte. There were lots of roadside zoos, places that began advertising miles in advance that offered a unique opportunity to see an albino raccoon, or a two-headed goat, or the world's smallest sheepdog. I could never understand why my father wasn't willing to stop at every single roadside zoo in the West. Even now, I can't explain it. I realize, of course, that the zoos were come-ons for filling stations or maybe even flim-flam dice games, but I still can't imagine passing up an opportunity to see an albino raccoon. Also, the stops were about the only time I could concentrate on what I was supposed to be seeing, relieved temporarily from the tension of maintaining a full border alert in the back seat. At the end of the day, we always knew how many miles we had driven. It was of only academic interest to her. We never had any reservations or any particular time we had to be anywhere. Still, we took some pride in covering ground. When I got old enough to travel with friends, we concentrated on making time as if we were trying to beat a rival expedition to the pole. The summer I got out of high school, I drove with two friends to the Minnesota Lake Country for a canoe trip, and even on the way, we waited until red lights to change drivers so as not to waste any time. Although I can't think of much we were doing with our time in Kansas City that summer beyond going down to Leroy's Tavern to talk dirty. I later found out that the English, who don't have nearly as much ground to cover, tend to view the American approach to highway travel as somewhere between baffling and pathological. A couple of years after I got out of college, some English friends of mine were given a ride from northern Spain to Paris by an American we all knew, and to their astonishment, he drove straight through without stopping. They came to the conclusion that he was suffering from a latent death wish. And I informed him that our mutual friend had merely driven from northern Spain to Paris, the way any red-blooded American boy would drive from northern Spain to Paris. He made good time. Growing up tends not to cure Americans of the notion that the number of miles covered is an important gauge to the success of pleasure travel. In fact, the American tour industry operates on the assumption that it's dealing with people in a hurry. The way tourism is now organized in America, it's assumed that travelers who want to see some calves roped and some broncos busted while in the West will take advantage of some efficiently packaged place with a name like Rodeo Land, USA, or maybe Cowboy Country. Actually, it wouldn't be surprising to find Rodeo Land, USA in New Jersey, a western wonderland plopped into the Jersey swamps to take advantage of what I sometimes call the doctrine of creative inappropriateness. The doctrine is based on the theory that tourists will stop in an ersatz alpine town in Georgia, not simply because they think it might be years before they get to Switzerland itself, but because the treasure is the notion of the gift shop clerk saying something like, "I'm fixing to show y'all some real nice lederhosen." Making good time though, say, Texas. The potential visitors to Rodeo Land, USA, figure that if they luck into an uncrowded Burger King for lunch, they might make Albuquerque by dark and have a 500-mile day under their belts. The kids want to see a rodeo, but not at the cost of having to sit in a broken-down grandstand for a couple of hours, knowing that each minute is a minute more they'll have to wait before hitting the pool at the Albuquerque Best Western. Rodeo Land and USA will offer them 2 or 3 representative rodeo events in a modern grandstand. There will be a multimedia exhibit on rodeo history and a room devoted to one of the 4 largest collections of barbed wire in the world, and several legendary broncos and wild bulls will be displayed, stuffed, in action poses. There might be a mechanical bronco for the braver kids to try out. There will be clean and well-maintained restrooms. There will be a gift shop that has souvenir t-shirts and lassos and Rodeo Land USA ashtrays and Rodeo Land USA beer caddies and some coffee mugs inscribed with cow chip jokes. There will be snack bars featuring the Buckin' Bull Burger, and all of this is not counting the souvenirs, and the bull burgers will be included in a single family special one-shot admission charge. The entire visit will be over in 45 minutes. Cowboys will have been seen. Albuquerque will be reached before dark. My wife Alice and I happened to be out west in the summer of 1971. Our first daughter, Abigail, who was then 2 years old, was with us. I had a couple of weeks' work to do in Gallup, New Mexico, a trading town on the edge of the Navajo reservation, and we found a Holiday Inn with a large enclosed grassy area and a little playground. As we were getting Abigail some dinner in the motel dining room on the second evening of our stay, the waitress said, "Car breakdown?" I didn't understand the question until I realized that she had never seen a family stay more than one night. It was at that moment that I realized something essential about American travel. Americans drive across the country as if someone is chasing them. They tend to move across Europe at the same pace. Traveling in Europe, some of them may give up counting miles and start counting cathedrals, or even countries. For anyone who has ever made good time on Interstate 70, there aren't enough miles in Europe to make any difference. While we were in Gallup, we drove out to a ramshackle little arena on the Navajo reservation for a rodeo that was nothing like the one at Rodeo Land USA. Rodeos, like pickup trucks and country and western music, have been folded into Navajo culture. The contestants were tough, wiry Navajo cowboys. The crowd in the grandstand was distinguished by a number of traditionally dressed Navajo women, each of whom seemed to be wearing the price of a string of rodeo ponies in silver around her neck. We had found out about the rodeo through an advertisement taped in a drugstore window in Gallup. On a stroll down the main street in any town, we often stopped to read notices taped in a drugstore window, just in the off chance that we happened to have hit town on the very evening that the volunteer fire department is holding the annual hog roast that has become a legend throughout the entire end of the state. I suppose you could say that we're not usually in much of a hurry. For a long time, I didn't know any other way of explaining how the sort of pleasure trading we do differs from the sort that amounts to being chased down the interstate. But several years ago, I finally realized that we spend a lot of time in activities that the Leroy's Tavern crowd would call hanging around. Some people who thrive on the bright lights and the certified sights may say that as travelers, we're just easily entertained. I can't deny that I get pretty excited if I learn that by extraordinary chance, The very weekend we happen to be in some fishing town on Chesapeake Bay is the day of the annual oyster roast. In fact, I'd be pretty excited to find out that Wednesday, the day we happen to be in some provincial city in Mexico, is the day local farmers bring their produce to the town square. And if it turns out that they come on Thursdays, we're very likely to stay over. Given an extra afternoon, we could always visit the little church that got to look sort of interesting the 6th or 7th time we passed it. Or we could always take another stroll down a street whose shop showed some indication of constituting the broken hardware district. If we're looking for a window display of broken hardware, the second time, it wouldn't be surprising if the proprietor, in a friendly sort of way, said, "Your car break down?" Actually, our car did break down once in a lovely coastal town called Elk, California. This was when Abigail and her younger sister Sarah were teenagers. We never had a nicer day anywhere. Partly, I think, because there was no question of moving on. I was reminded of a time just before Abigail was born when Alice and I found ourselves with a 1-week enforced stay in the Kingdom of Tonga because of a fortuitous mechanical problem in what was then Air Polynesia's entire fleet of planes. The Kingdom of Tonga, which sometimes billed itself as the Friendly Islands, turned out to be an exception to the general rule that a comfortable hotel becomes economically feasible in an island paradise when the number of tourists increases to the point at which the island is no longer a paradise. A couple of years before, in anticipation of the important international visitors expected for the coronation of King Taufa'ahau Tupou IV, the capital city of Nuku'alofa had acquired a hotel of the sort that would ordinarily not have been expected until there were enough tourists to support 4 or 5 boutiques and a Hertz agency. As a sort of bonus, the most splendid public functions of the kingdom were held in the hotel's outdoor dining room, so that the few overnight guests became included merely by showing up for dinner, a policy that permitted us to be present at the Miss Nuku'alofa contest won by a young woman who was sponsored by a local bakery and entered as Miss Friendly Island Biscuits. Some cities, of course, seem almost designed for hanging around. I think of Lucca in northern Tuscany that way. The central part of the city is surrounded by a wall, a proper brick rampart built in the 16th and 17th centuries by people who thought they might have heard of a lot of nice things about the Florentines, still held to the old maxim that good fences make good neighbors. The wall is thick enough to provide a shaded thoroughfare on top for people interested in literally taking a walk around town. Within the wall, automobile traffic is limited, and in a core of narrow, meandering streets, non-existent. People have favorite bits of Lucan architecture, a particular Romanesque church, a red brick tower, a courtyard that turns out to be an ancient amphitheater. I'm partial myself to the Church of San Michele, whose front wall has 2 elaborate extra floors extending above the roof, as if the architect were a baker who so loved making decorative icing that he continued even after he had run out of cake. But for people with a predilection for hanging around, the best thing about central Lucca is the way the palace is put together. At 6 or 7 in the evening, the entire city seems to be out on a stroll, stopping here and there to chat with a friend or buy a loaf of bread or inspect a shop window. Lucca is, I think, what Americans on their way to Italy had in mind when they try to envision what Florence must be like. Well, minus the sort of art Florence has, of course, although there are those who would argue that Lucca's best-known product is what would have resulted if a multi-talented man like Michelangelo had turned his hand to the manufacture of olive oil. On the other hand, we've hung around happily in Tokyo and on small Caribbean islands, and at some point I figured out what my father might have known all along about family travel. It doesn't take a tremendous amount of difference where you go, as long as the family has escaped in a pack from the preoccupations of home. A tourist court in Santa Monica is not that different from a house in Provence. Well, I don't mean that we haven't spent a lot of time selecting destinations. After we had begun taking the girls along on trips during what I always thought of as the window of opportunity, that period when children are old enough to travel with their parents comfortably, but not old enough to have better things to do. We had criteria that moved over the years from the availability of disposable diapers, we didn't expect them in Tonga, to the proximity of beaches. When Alice and I took a trip by ourselves, our choice was affected by what I'm afraid is a weakness on Alice's part for romantic spots with views. A weakness I've always attributed to the fact that Alice, having been an only child in a family not given to long summer car trips, was deprived of the opportunity to learn that travel is less about romance than about protecting your side of the back seat. Alice and I and the girls never took the same sort of car trip that I used to take with my parents and Suki. We talked about it now and then, but it never worked out. Living in New York, of course, meant that we were not equally convenient to either coast, and as a loyal son of the plains, I always winced when Alice suggested that we simply fly over the middle part of the country to someplace like Denver or Albuquerque and then drive through what she persisted in calling the interesting part. I'm sorry we never got to drive across the country with the girls. It's too late now. They've got better things to do. I still think back on a lot on those trips I took as a child, especially when I'm driving through some part of the country I particularly like the looks of. The Oregon coast, or the high desert of New Mexico, or the plains of central Kansas, near where I grew up, where the strain of wheat they plant now comes in short and thick, like a 50s crew cut. I sometimes imagine myself at the wheel and my own girls in the back seat, in an air-conditioned car this time, but still somehow on Route 66. We're somewhere between Amarillo and Tucumcari, heading west. A sign along the side of the highway says, "Just ahead, see albino raccoon." I put my foot on the brake. That didn't take